Chapter 1 of Travels and Adventures of an Orchid Hunter by Albert Millican. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1 On Board the Phantom. Having fully made up my mind for a long sea voyage, and taken my ticket for anywhere and everywhere beyond the seas, I provided myself with a stock of knives, cutlasses, revolvers, rifle, an overflowing supply of tobacco and newspapers, and started on the third Saturday of the 8th month of Her Majesty Queen Victoria's Jubilee year. After the usual ceremony of tipping railway porters and cab drivers, I went on board the steam tug Sunshine, taking passengers and mails from the Princess Landing Stage, Liverpool, for embarkation on the Celestial Company's steamship Phantom, then bound for the Spanish Main. A few minutes' sail brought us alongside the Phantom, where, after a careful inspection of the eating saloon, cabins, water filters, etc., by my unhappy relatives, who consisted of several maiden aunts, fifth cousins, and godchildren, they eventually said good-bye, and, as if to drive home the old-fashioned words, each gave me at parting a remorseless hug. No sooner had the Sunshine re-embarked her living freight of weeping relatives, overgrown ship's agents and postmen, than a shrill screech from the funnel of the Sunshine, echoed back by a dull crunching sound from the screw of the Phantom, announced to all on board that we were in a fair way for a separation for an indefinite period from wives and sweethearts, as well as the soothing associations of an English fireside. The Phantom, although only a small ship of 200 tons burden, soon showed her superiority of sailing over her other river companions by passing many large ships, which seemed to me to be encumbered by a superfluous arrangement of poles and white cotton, and it was not long before the white-crested rollers of the ocean showed us that the mudbanks of the Mersey were left far behind. On looking round for what society the ship afforded, I found Spratt, the captain, an excellent fellow, who, besides the valuable information acquired by a long experience in and out of almost every port on the surface of the globe, possessed a good vein of humour, not at all despisable under the circumstances. Besides, he was not given to boring his companions in conversation with a long history of how many of those remarkable beings called lords, earls, dukes, marquises, etc., he had safely piloted over the Atlantic. I also noticed two of the passengers. The one, a stout burly gentleman of from 45 to 50 years of age, to all appearances a retired sea captain. It might have been of a slave trader. The other, a delicate lady of 18, a beauty with the figure of a Venus and the features of a nymph, and a pair of large, black, fathomless eyes that would grace an Andalusian, whose melancholy was softened by dimpled cheeks of the most delicate peach bloom, the whole framed with a rich profusion of waving raven hair, a glance at which was sufficient to give you the impression that you had the pleasure of seeing a beautiful woman. A casual observer would imagine that the relationship between the elderly gentleman and the fair young lady was that of father and daughter, or guardian and ward. Imagine my surprise when at lunch time I heard bald-headed Mr. Sharples inquire, "Can I help you to a little of this fish, Mrs. Sharples?" As I looked across the table I thought I detected a slight shrug of the fair shoulders, and the melancholy of the melancholy eyes intensify. There might be something of sorrow hid behind so extraordinary a union. However, all the explanation that ever I had was contained in the underside of the lid of a work basket, where, accidentally, I saw stitched in letters of comfort, "Better be an old man's darling than a young man's slave." As we steamed slowly away from land, each one on board seemed to linger on deck to watch the gray line of cliffs grow more faint and indistinguishable, until finally nothing was left to us of old England but cherished recollections, and night, throwing her dusky mantle over all, those who could began to seek asylum in their cabins, glad to escape from the weariness of a long day's excitement, the beautiful calm of the sea reassuring even the most timid. And now, for the benefit of those who are not accustomed to ship's bedroom furniture, let me endeavour to describe that used on the Phantom. The bedsteads, commonly dubbed with the unceremonious title of bunks, are really large shelves, 2 in each room, one placed above the other, the lower one about 2 feet from the floor, and the other about 4 feet, very much reminding one of the shelves used in larders for jam and etc., except that each shelf is provided with a high edge, being a board about 1.5 feet wide. This, with the 4 feet distance from the floor, renders it absolutely indispensable for the occupant of the top shelf to perform night and morning, or as often as required, a no very desirable feat of gymnastics in order to place himself behind the side of the shelf. Aside from this stiffness in the bedsteads, everything seemed to be made on an opposite principle. Water bottles, candlesticks, towel rails, etc., being suspended with as many joints as would lead one to imagine that each had emanated from a school of engineering, where the application of the ball and socket was a specialty. However, after the foregoing inventory of my bedroom furniture, and a marvellous triumph of agility that I really never gave myself credit for, I managed to scramble safely onto one of the shelves, the lower one, as may be supposed, where after some dim visions of shipwreck, pirates, and cannibal islands, I slept soundly until 6 o'clock next morning, and I was only awakened by an extraordinary motion alternately elevating my head and heels above the level of my body. Hastily dressing and going on deck, I found that through the night a strong head wind had arisen, whipping the sea into large foam-crested rolling billows, and making our little Phantom swing and dance in a way that would put a switchback railway in the shade. One side of the ship would suddenly dive down until the top of her deck touched the water, while the other side was high in the air at an elevation of 30 feet, and this in turn would descend with a splash and a roar. At the same time several tons of salt water would sweep across her upper decks, and as quickly, with the change of position, blow over the side, this continual vibration being kept up for a period of not less than 4 days and 4 nights, sufficient to convince nervous people, not accustomed to seafaring peculiarities, that the owners of the Phantom had secretly entered into a contract with the Society for the Development of the Theory of Perpetual Motion. This unwarrantable infringement of the commonest laws of equilibrium materially affected the comfortable enjoyment of a bill of fare, which, although really good for the situation, was not absolutely free from that inevitable repetition of certain dishes to commemorate days of the week. For instance, pea soup Wednesdays and Fridays, plum dough Sundays and Thursdays, a regularity strangely peculiar to jails, workhouses, and barracks, and a system by which sailors marked the days of the week without the assistance of Whitaker. The table was provided with 2 long laths, which extended the whole length of each side at a sufficient distance from each other to admit of a plate being firmly wedged between the 2, leaving room at the corners for all indispensable table utensils. The dishes containing the food were arranged in a line along the middle of the table, each dish partitioned off from his neighbour by a capacious bolster of serviettes. But even this contrivance did not prevent the chicken from dexterously changing places with the sardines, or the butter becoming irretrievably mixed with the curry, in a way which, even considering the extraordinary motion of the ship, appeared perfectly ludicrous. An attempt to avoid an overbalance by clutching your chair with both hands, which chair, by the way, is screwed securely to the floor, would result in the upsetting of a cup of hot coffee into your lap, or the inundation of your plate by the contents of an adjoining water bottle. On retiring to my cabin in the evening, I was greeted from the surrounding partitions with most unearthly sounds of choking. On inquiry, I was informed that all the ladies on board had been attacked with that uncomfortable disorder of the nerves or stomach called seasickness, which effectually confined them to their cabins for the ensuing week. And now how to sleep in a bedroom performing such extraordinary antics was a problem not easily solved. It occurred to me to imitate the fellow who, on account of the effects of an overdose of Pommery 76 or some more disreputable stuff, sat down on the floor to wait until the bedstead would stop for him to get into bed. However, after this experience, the rude wind finally betook himself to other climes to play his unwelcome pranks, and the sea settled down from a turbulent, boiling mass of white foam to that calm, placid blue that would fain make believe it was always like that. All this time we had seen nothing but an occasional passing ship of the kind I had remarked coming out of the Mersey, so superfluously encumbered with sticks and cords. Now their utility became apparent. Each bundle of cloth had been unwound and dexterously hung in position best calculated to court the society of a fickle breeze. Each available corner was crowded, and the spotless whiteness of the canvas, intensified by the bright sunlight and the soft blue of the ocean, when contrasted with our own combination of smoky funnels and clanking engines, would give one to imagine that the strange, fantastic craft was a visitor from the supernatural, or that Mercury, to better perform some peculiar nautical errand, had taken upon him the form of a gigantic sea bird. However, putting all allegory aside, there is no more beautiful sight at sea than a full-rigged ship in sail on a fine day. After about 6 days' sailing, I noticed one morning a long dark gray line on the horizon, which I imagined, in my want of marine experience, to be some passing whale, or better still, could it not be the long chronicled and much exaggerated sea serpent out for his morning gambol? This pleasing delusion was quickly dispelled when Captain Spratt politely informed me that my wonderful sea serpent was nothing less than the island called Terceira, one of the Azores, situated in latitude 38° 37' north and longitude 27° 13' west, furnishing a beautiful semi-tropical retreat for visitors, and a most useful coaling station in any emergency for vessels crossing the Atlantic. The Phantom kept on her course, making for the West Indian island of Barbados. The passengers passed the time lounging on deck, smoking, and watching the large flights of flying fish which rose out of the water at intervals and skimmed along a distance of 30 yards, making their large wing-like fins glisten in the sunshine like burnished silver, and then dipped themselves again into the water to be refreshed after so extraordinary an exertion. Those who have been long out at sea in fine weather cannot fail to remark the gorgeous spectacle presented by a sunset in a tropical latitude. As the mighty orb sinks slowly behind the distant band of blue, large masses of milky clouds gather around to honor the departure of the king of day, and, in return for their courtly attentions, are invested with a part of the fading splendor. Mountains of soft gray, while you are watching them, deepen into rich purple and gold. Cascades of silver and fountains of flame dance and sparkle in valleys of deep azure. Fantastic palaces with crystal towers would persuade the spectator that if fairyland exists, it must be somewhere in this vicinity. Early on Saturday morning, September 13th, after tumbling about on the Atlantic for 14 days, we came in sight of the island of Barbados. At first sight from the sea, the wonder hunter is somewhat disappointed in the low, shelving appearance of the land. But this impression is quickly counteracted on a nearer approach by the varied and delicate hues of the large patches of sugar canes, clumps of cocoanut palms, and groups of bananas, with occasional dainty little villas peeping out from amongst the groves of mangoes, breadfruit trees, and the gorgeous scarlet-flowered shrub called the frangipani, whose myriad clusters of blossoms contrast beautifully with the darker foliage distinguishable at a greater distance. Coming still nearer to the harbour of Bridgetown, we passed the lighthouse and flag station. The magnificent hotel at Hastings, which makes a charming resort for many European holiday makers at this point of the bay, is seen to great advantage. As we passed the fine barracks, the shrill bugle call reminded us of the company of British officers and men who were passing a lively time amongst the agreeable Barbadians, and who, from what stray political opinions I could overhear, appeared quite able to set us an example in loyalty. The Phantom took up her position amongst the many other ships which were engaged in discharging cargo or awaiting orders from England. The houses of Bridgetown, fringing the harbour, are constructed of a light pinky stone, which, seen in the strong light of this climate, presents a most attractive appearance. Almost before the anchors had swung out of the bows of the Phantom, the ship was surrounded by a crowd of curly pated negroes, with long rows of white teeth and rolling eyes, contrasting amusingly with their ebony features. Some would make dexterous plunges and come up again on the other side of the ship, performing the clever feat for sixpence, while a group of youngsters were fighting and sputtering for occasional pence thrown to them by the passengers. Others would display a collection of wares for sale, all expressing their opinion or courting attention in a kind of jargon which reduced the Queen's English to a most miserable snarl. After the usual visit of inspection from doctors and custom house officers, we were at liberty to go on shore by the medium of one of the many boats either hovering in the vicinity of the ship or crowding around the gangway, each of their black owners meanwhile squabbling for patronage. I need hardly say that all on board the Phantom who could, availed themselves of the positive luxury of a little exercise on terra firma after a fortnight's cramping in bunks and deck chairs. A few well directed strokes brought us to shore, and no more extraordinary sight presented itself to the newly arrived European than the motley medley of human faces, from the fair rose of the delicate European lady to the polished black of the negro, with the various between shades, all busy about their morning marketing. The lover of tropical curios will find here quite a museum to choose from. Pink and white coral of the most delicate shades, gossamer masterpieces of the coral insect's ingenuity, patterns worthy of imitation by our most skilful lace and filigree workers, midget hummingbirds in scarlet and green, which Nature, indulgent goddess, has provided with a special court dress to enable them more effectually to steal the virtue of innocent flowers, delicate leaves and blossoms cunningly manufactured from glittering fish scales, work in seeds, moss, and tortoise shell; in short, everything beautiful and curious, well calculated to draw the money out of foreigners' pockets. Passing through streets of well-kept shops, most uncomfortably crowded with groups of gossiping negroes, we finally arrived at the principal hotel, called the Ice House, where each thirsty soul indulged in ice cream or native lemonade, which was most refreshing, considering the thermometer at this time registered the modest figure of 90° Fahrenheit in the shade. After an hour's stroll amongst the pretty villas, gardens, and plantations of the suburbs, the hoisting of the Blue Peter and the sound of a gun informed us that the Phantom was ready to continue the journey. So we lost no time in getting on board, and as we steamed slowly out of the harbour, another glimpse at the beautiful surroundings extorted from us a sigh of regret at so short a stay, and a hope to return at no distant period. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina.